Okay, this is the end of Chapter 4, finishing up biodiversity and evolution. Last time we studied biodiversity, different types of biodiversity, and how new species evolve. Today we want to continue discussing evolution and how species evolve. First of all, speciation. Speciation is when one species splits into two or more species. This can happen when there are genes in the population, two sets of genes in the population that are selected for, and then the population can split and evolve in two different directions. Another way is geographic isolation. The geographic isolation happens first. That's the physical isolation of populations for a long period of time. Maybe an earthquake separates two populations, and over time different genes are selected for in each population that's separated. They can't interbreed because they can't come into contact with each other, and they form new species on either side. The last is reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation occurs when mutations and natural selection in geographically isolated populations lead to the inability to produce offspring when members of two different populations mate. That is, two groups of the same population, two groups of the same species, can't come into contact with each other to mate and share genes.
It would be possible to
Okay, here's a picture showing geographic isolation and how it can lead to reproductive isolation. The Arctic fox and the gray fox, originally both the same species, separated, evolving into two different forms. Different environmental conditions led to selective pressures and evolution into two different species. Extinction. There's biological extinction and local extinction. Biological extinction is the extinction of all of the same species on Earth. Local extinction is the disappearance of a species in a particular area. For example, the disappearance of black bear in Ohio would be a local extinction. An endemic species. An endemic species is a native species. It's found only in one area, and endemic species are particularly vulnerable to extinction because they have such a limited range. Background extinction is the normal, typical low rate of extinction. Extinctions occur naturally. We've had 3 to 5 mass extinctions over the past 500 million years, but extinctions are happening much more rapidly currently due to human activities like habitat destruction. Scientists believe that 25% of the species in the world today could be extinct by 2050. This is an example of an extinct species, the golden toad of Costa Rica. Species diversity. The variety, the abundance of a species in a particular place. When we say species diversity, that just means regular biodiversity, the number of different types of species in an area. Species richness describes the number of different species in an area. For example, the tropical rainforest is very species rich. There's a lot of different types of species, whereas the desert is not as rich because there are fewer number of different types of species. Species evenness is the comparative number of individuals. Are there a lot of different types of species, or are there just one or two of those different types of species? That describes species evenness. It's more even if there are a lot of the individual different types, and it's less even if there are just a few individuals in each population. Diversity varies with geographical location. The example I gave you, the tropical rainforest in the desert. So diversity is going to vary depending on the location. The most species-rich communities are the tropical rainforests, coral reefs, the ocean bottom zone, and large tropical lakes. Here are two examples of species richness and species evenness. This is a coral reef, very species rich, but not very even. You can see there are a lot of different types of different organisms, but not many members of individual populations. You see many different species, but not a large number of each individual species. Over here, the northern woodland, the birch trees, A single species you see here is not very species rich. There's only one type of species, but the population or the environment is very species even because there are a lot of these birch trees. Here's a global map of plant biodiversity. You can see most of the biodiversity occurs near the equator, and it lessens as you approach the poles. Species-rich ecosystems tend to be more productive and more sustainable. A species-rich ecosystem has a greater primary productivity, so more plants to sustain more different types of animals above the plant level of the food chain, above the first trophic level. And the more different species there are in an ecosystem, the more complex the food web is. And if one part of that food web breaks for whatever reason, human activity or something, some type of natural disaster, if one species dies off, in a species-rich area, it's less likely that the food web will collapse because there are so many different paths on the food web that the individuals in the population can rely on some other type of food source. In a not rich community, food webs are very simple, and if one chain is broken, then the whole food web could collapse. That leads us to specialist and generalist species. Specialist species have a very narrow niche. A niche is like a species' job, everything that it does, everything that it interacts with in its lifetime. A specialist has a very narrow niche. A panda bear has a very narrow niche. They eat only bamboo. So if the bamboo disappears, that means that the panda bear is going to disappear. A generalist would be an example is in a raccoon. The generalist species rely on a variety of food sources. So if one disappears, there are other food sources available. Generalists are less likely to go extinct compared to specialists. Species can play 5 major roles within ecosystems. They can be a native species. A native species means that it belongs. It belongs in the area that it's growing, and that the native animals rely on that species for food and shelter. There are non-native species. They came from a different place and do not belong in the area. Sometimes they are called invasive species. There are indicator species. Indicator species are species that scientists study, keep a close eye on to show changes in the environment. They're particularly sensitive to changes in the environment. Amphibians are an example of indicator species. They're particularly susceptible to high levels of ultraviolet radiation, and they can tell us how much the ozone hole is causing damage to the Earth because they are sensitive to that ultraviolet radiation that reaches Earth's surface through the ozone hole. There are keystone species. Keystone species are essential to an ecosystem. If this species disappears, then the whole ecosystem collapses. An example of a keystone species is the sea otter. The sea otter in the early 1900s almost went extinct due to overhunting for the pelts. And what happened when the otter disappeared, the sea anemone that the otter ate, the population exploded. And then that anemone ate all of its food source because the population was so big, the sea kelp. Then the anemone didn't have any food to eat, so their population started to decline. So the whole food web collapsed. That's an example of a keystone species. If it's removed from an ecosystem, then the whole food web collapses. Last, there's a foundation species. A foundation species is one that maintains an ecosystem for the other animals and plants around it. For example, elephants push down trees in the savanna so that grass continues to grow, so it doesn't turn into a forest. That helps maintain the community where the elephants and the other community members live. Okay, to describe these a little bit more, an indicator species serve as biological smoke alarms. They provide early warning of damage to a community and can monitor environmental quality. Example, trout, birds, butterfly, and frogs. A keystone species, their role has a large effect on the types and abundance of other species. Pollinators like bees are a keystone species, top predators, and the sea otter, as I described. Finally, foundation species help to form the bases of ecosystem. They create or enhance their habitats which benefit others. Elephants are an example. I gave you that example earlier. Also, beavers that cut down trees and block rivers, creating lakes and ponds, change the ecosystem that benefits other living things.